The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet neighborhood, painting the streets in shades of amber and crimson. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, but for Officer Rick Hayes, peace wasn't something he cared much about. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always walking with a swagger that screamed authority, Rick had earned a reputation in the department, and not a good one. He was known for his temper, his ego, and most of all, his inability to treat everyone with the respect they deserved. To Rick, power meant control, and he wasn't afraid to throw his weight around. As he cruised down the street in his squad car, his radio crackled with a routine call, but Rick wasn't paying much attention. His eyes were drawn to the sidewalk, where an older black woman was slowly making her way toward the bus stop, clutching a large bag of groceries in her arms. She looked like she was struggling, her pace uneven as the weight of the bag pulled her to one side. She was dressed simply, a faded floral dress and sensible shoes, the kind you'd expect on a grandmother. Her face was lined with years of wisdom, but her posture showed exhaustion. Rick smirked. "Look at her, jaywalking like she owns the place," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. To him, it didn't matter that the woman wasn't bothering anyone, or that she seemed to be minding her own business. In his mind, authority needed to be established, even in the smallest ways. He pulled the car over, the tires screeching slightly as he came to an abrupt stop. The woman turned her head, startled by the noise, and her eyes locked with Rick's. There was a moment of hesitation, but then she straightened up, her expression calm but unreadable. She didn't say anything, just watched as the officer climbed out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. "Hey," Rick called out, his voice loud and sharp. "You can't just walk wherever you feel like. This isn't your personal street." The woman blinked, clearly confused. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I said, you're jaywalking," Rick snapped, pointing at the stretch of road she'd just crossed. "You're holding up traffic. You know that's against the law, right?" The woman looked around. The street was nearly empty, save for a few parked cars and a distant hum of an engine far down the road. "There's no traffic," she replied, her voice steady. "And I'm not causing any harm. I'm just trying to catch the bus." Rick's patience was wearing thin. He hated being questioned, especially by someone he thought should just comply and move along. "Don't get smart with me," he warned, stepping closer. "You think you're above the law or something." The woman sighed, clearly not wanting to escalate the situation. "I'm not trying to argue with you, officer. I'm just saying there's no need for all this." But Rick wasn't listening. He was already fuming, his temper flaring as it often did when he felt disrespected. "You people are always full of excuses," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for her to hear. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, but she kept her composure. "What do you mean, you people, she asked, her tone sharp now. Rick rolled his eyes. "Don't play dumb with me," he shot back. "You know exactly what I mean." Before the woman could respond, Rick reached out and snatched the grocery bag from her hands. "Let's see what you're carrying in here," he said, rifling through it without her permission. Apples, bread, a carton of milk, nothing remotely suspicious. Still, Rick acted like he was doing her a favor. "You're lucky I don't write you up for this," he sneered, shoving the bag back into her arms. The woman staggered slightly under the weight, but quickly regained her balance. Her face remained calm, though there was a fire in her eyes now, a quiet strength that Rick hadn't noticed before. "You're out of line," she said firmly, "and I'm going to report you." Rick laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "Report me? To who?" he asked, towering over her. "Lady, I am the law around here. You really think anyone's gonna listen to you?" For a moment, the two stood in tense silence, the air between them crackling like static electricity. Then, without warning, Rick did the unthinkable. Frustrated and eager to assert his dominance, he raised his hand and slapped the bag of groceries out of her arms, sending it crashing to the ground. The milk carton burst open, spilling its contents onto the pavement, while apples rolled into the gutter. The woman gasped, stunned by the blatant act of aggression. A small crowd had started to gather now, drawn by the commotion. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, their expressions a mix of shock and disapproval. Rick, realizing he might have gone too far, straightened up and adjusted his belt, trying to regain his composure. "That's what happens when you don't follow the rules," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. But the woman didn't cower. She didn't shrink back or turn away. Instead, she looked Rick dead in the eyes, her gaze steady and unyielding. "You've made a big mistake," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made even Rick pause for a moment. "Oh yeah." He shot back, his bravado returning. "And what mistake is that?" The woman didn't answer right away. She bent down slowly, picking up her spilled groceries with deliberate care, ignoring the mess on her dress or the stares from the crowd. When she finally stood back up, she looked at Rick with a calm intensity that sent a chill down his spine. "You'll find out soon enough," she said simply, before turning and walking away, leaving Rick standing there with a smug grin that masked his unease. What Rick didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this wasn't just some random encounter with a harmless old lady. This was a turning point, a moment that would come back to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. Because the woman he had just humiliated wasn't just anyone. She was someone with power, someone who had the authority to change Rick's life forever. And by the time he found out who she really was, it would be far too late to undo the damage he had done. The next morning, as Rick swaggered into the police station, still feeling invincible, he would be greeted with a sight that stopped him dead in his tracks. His new commanding officer, the one sent to clean up the department and enforce stricter accountability, was waiting for him in her office. And when she turned around, Rick's heart sank. It was her, the woman from the street. Her eyes met his, and for the first time in his career, Officer Rick Hayes was at a complete loss for words. Rick stood frozen in the doorway, the air in the room suddenly heavy and suffocating. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Sitting behind the desk in the office marked Commanding Officer was the same older black woman he had humiliated on the street just hours ago. She was calm, her hands neatly folded on the desk, her sharp eyes fixed on him. She wasn't angry, not visibly anyway, but there was something about her presence that unnerved him. Her confidence, her poise. It felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, and for the first time in years, Rick felt small. "Officer Hayes," she said, her voice smooth and steady, yet commanding in a way that left no room for argument. "Come in." Rick hesitated. He glanced around the precinct, hoping someone else might save him from this moment. But his fellow officers were either too busy or too curious to intervene. A few of them exchanged glances, clearly picking up on the tension, but no one dared to step in. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. A storm brewing, and Rick was at the center of it. "Close the door behind you," she added, her tone polite but firm. Rick swallowed hard and stepped inside, closing the door as instructed. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have, echoing in the silence of the room. He stood stiffly, his hands fidgeting at his sides, unsure of where to look. For the first time in his career, Rick Hayes was genuinely nervous. The woman didn't speak right away. She took her time, studying him with a measured gaze that seemed to peel back every layer of his carefully constructed bravado. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Officer Hayes," she began, her voice even, "do you know who I am?" Rick cleared his throat, scrambling to find words that wouldn't make this situation worse. No, ma'am," he said, his voice lacking its usual cocky edge. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile that wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that told you she already knew the answer to every question she was about to ask. "My name is Evelyn Carter. As of this morning, I am the new chief of police for this precinct." Rick's stomach dropped. Chief of police. He hadn't seen that coming. The department had been talking for weeks about a shake-up in leadership, but no one had expected ***, not someone like her. And she continued, her voice steady, "If I'm not mistaken, we've already met." Rick opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to defend himself, but no words came out. He was caught, and he knew it. Evelyn didn't wait for him to stumble through an excuse. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk and clasping her hands together. "Officer Hayes, let me ask you something. Do you believe in accountability?" For the first time in his career, Rick Hayes wasn't sure if he was up to the challenge, and deep down, a part of him was terrified to find out. Rick sat at his desk, staring blankly at the file Chief Carter had handed him. He hadn't opened it yet, but he could feel the weight of it, as though it held every mistake he'd ever made in his career. The precinct buzzed around him with the usual chaos, phones ringing, officers moving in and out, and the low hum of chatter, but Rick couldn't focus on any of it. His reputation had taken hits before, sure, but this was different. She wasn't like any superior he'd dealt with before. She was sharp, commanding, and worst of all, she had seen him at his worst. He glanced around the room. Some of his colleagues were watching him, exchanging whispers behind their coffee cups. Rick wasn't sure if they knew the whole story or were just enjoying the rare sight of him looking rattled. Either way, it made his skin crawl. He had always been the guy with the upper hand, the one people avoided crossing. Now, it felt like the tables had turned, and everyone was waiting to see how far he would fall. After what felt like forever, he finally opened the file. The first page alone was enough to make his stomach twist. Complaints from civilians, reports from fellow officers, and notes about incidents that had been swept under the rug. It was all there, laid out in black and white. He flipped through the pages, his frustration building with every line. Some of it felt exaggerated, blown out of proportion, but some of it he couldn't deny. He slammed the file shut and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just a warning. It was a reminder that his time was running out. If he didn't change, if he didn't prove he could be better, his career was as good as over. Across the room, Officer Daniels, one of Rick's few allies in the precinct, walked over and leaned against his desk. Daniels was younger, eager, and one of the few people who didn't seem to judge Rick for his rough edges. "Rough day, huh?" Daniels said, his tone light but sympathetic. Rick shot him a look. "You could say that." Daniels nodded, glancing at the closed file. "So, is it true? She's the woman from yesterday." Rick hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah, it's her." Daniels let out a low whistle. "Man, that's rough." Rick didn't respond. What was there to say? He had screwed up, and now he was paying the price. "But hey," Daniels said, trying to lighten the mood, "maybe it's not all bad. She seems fair, you know. Tough, but fair." Rick frowned. "Fair? You think this is fair? She's out to make an example of me, Daniels. That's not fair, that's personal." Daniels shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe she just wants to see if you're worth keeping around." Rick didn't reply. He didn't want to admit it, but Daniels might have a point. Still, the thought of answering to Evelyn Carter day in and day out made his blood boil. He wasn't used to being questioned, let alone by someone who had every reason to hold a grudge against him. The rest of the day dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not just by Carter, but by everyone. Every interaction felt like a test, every decision scrutinized. He hated it. By the time his shift ended, Rick was exhausted. He left the precinct without saying much to anyone and drove home, the events of the day replaying in his mind. His small apartment felt emptier than usual as he stepped inside, tossing his keys onto the counter. The walls were bare, the furniture simple and practical. It wasn't much, but it was home, or at least it had been. He sat on the couch and flipped on the TV, hoping to drown out his thoughts, but nothing held his attention. His mind kept drifting back to Carter, to the way she had looked at him in her office. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even shown much emotion, but somehow she had managed to completely dismantle his confidence. Rick leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he didn't recognize: shame. Not anger, not frustration, just pure, unfiltered shame. The next morning, Rick arrived at the precinct early, hoping to avoid the usual stares and whispers. He wasn't sure what his plan was, maybe to prove he could handle himself, to show Carter he wasn't the man she thought he was. But as soon as he walked through the doors, he realized it wasn't going to be that simple. Carter was already there, standing in the center of the bullpen with a group of officers gathered around her. She was addressing them, her tone calm but commanding. Rick couldn't hear everything she was saying, but he caught enough to know she was laying down the law. "This department has a responsibility to the community," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "And that starts with accountability, both to the people we serve and to each other. I expect every officer here to hold themselves to the highest standard. Anything less is unacceptable." Rick stood off to the side, listening but not wanting to be seen. He felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name as he watched her speak. She wasn't just talking the talk, she believed every word she was saying. And for the first time, Rick wondered if maybe he was the one who was out of step. After the meeting broke up, Carter's eyes found his across the room. She didn't say anything, didn't even nod, but the look she gave him was enough to send a chill down his spine. It wasn't anger or judgment, it was expectation. As the day went on, Rick tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested. Every interaction with the public, every decision he made, felt like it was being watched, evaluated, and maybe it was. At one point, he found himself patrolling a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. He spotted a young boy sitting on the curb, his bike tipped over beside him. The boy looked upset, his face streaked with tears. Rick hesitated. Normally he would have driven past without a second thought. Kids fell off their bikes all the time. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the weight of Carter's words from earlier, or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't fully understand. He pulled the car over and stepped out, walking over to the boy. "Hey kid," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You all right?" The boy looked up, surprised. He sniffled and wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "I fell," he said, his voice small. Rick crouched down, inspecting the boy's scraped knee. It wasn't serious, just a shallow cut, but the kid looked like the world had ended. "Looks like you'll live," Rick said with a small smile. "You got a first aid kit at home?" The boy nodded. "Yeah, my mom has one." "All right, let's get you home then," Rick said, standing up and lifting the boy's bike. "Where do you live?" The boy pointed to a house a few doors down, and Rick walked with him, the bike in one hand and a new, unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt useful. Not powerful, not in control, just useful. As he walked back to his car, Rick couldn't help but wonder if this was what Carter had been talking about. Accountability, responsibility, serving the community. It all sounded so simple when she said it, but living it was something else entirely. Rick wasn't sure if he could change, wasn't sure if he even wanted to. But as he sat in his car, watching the boy wave at him from the safety of his front porch, he realized something. Maybe it was time to try. Rick's days at the precinct became a balancing act, a constant struggle between his old habits and the growing awareness that things needed to change. Chief Carter had made it clear. She was watching him, and so was everyone else. He hated the scrutiny, the way his every move felt like it was being dissected, but more than that, he hated the nagging voice in the back of his mind, whispering that maybe he deserved it. His interactions with the community were different now. He still walked with that same authoritative stride, but his approach was softer, more thoughtful. He noticed things he never cared to notice before: the nervous glances from people of color when he approached, the guarded body language, the way they braced themselves for the worst. He hated that he had been the kind of cop who made people feel that way. He hated that he was still trying to convince himself he wasn't that guy. One afternoon, Rick was assigned to patrol a lower-income neighborhood known for its tensions with law enforcement. He didn't mind the assignment. He had worked this area before and thought he knew how to handle it. But as he drove past the rows of run-down houses and graffiti-covered walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. The air felt heavy, the streets quieter than usual. As he turned a corner, he spotted a group of teenagers gathered outside a small convenience store. They weren't doing anything overtly suspicious, just talking and laughing, but Rick felt the familiar prickle of unease. He slowed the car, rolling down the window. "Everything all right here?" he called out, his tone carefully neutral. The laughter stopped, and the teens turned to look at him. Their expressions shifted, defensive, wary. A tall boy with dreadlocks stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. "We're good, officer," the boy said, his voice calm but firm. Rick nodded, his eyes scanning the group. "All right, just making sure." He wanted to drive away, to let it go, but his instincts told him to stick around. His gut had rarely steered him wrong in the past, but lately he wasn't sure if it was instincts or old habits driving his actions. As Rick lingered, one of the younger boys muttered something under his breath. Rick didn't catch it, but the tone was enough to make his blood rise. He stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. "What was that?" Rick asked, his voice low. The younger boy froze, his eyes wide with fear. The tall boy stepped in front of him, holding Rick's gaze. He didn't say anything, he said, his tone steady but edged with defiance. Rick stared at him, his jaw tightening. The old Rick, the one who thrived on intimidation and control, wanted to push, to assert his authority. But something stopped him. He saw the fear in their eyes, the way they braced themselves for what they thought was coming. It was a look he had seen before, but this time it hit differently. "All right," Rick said finally, his voice softer. "Just keep it down, okay?" The tall boy nodded, his expression unreadable. Rick got back in his car and drove off, his grip on the steering wheel tight. He told himself he had handled it well, that he had avoided escalating the situation. But the truth was, he felt like a fraud. He had wanted to intimidate them, even if only for a moment. Was that instinct? Or was it something worse? Back at the precinct, Rick couldn't shake the encounter. He'd avoided Carter's gaze as he walked to his desk, but he could feel her presence, her silent judgment. He wondered if she already knew, if she had somehow seen the whole thing unfold. It wouldn't surprise him. Carter seemed to have a way of knowing everything. As the day wore on, Rick's unease grew. Something about that group of kids had stuck with him, gnawed at him. They hadn't done anything wrong, but he couldn't stop thinking about the tension in their faces, the way they had looked at him like he was the enemy. That night, as Rick was getting ready to leave, Carter called him into her office. He hesitated outside the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He didn't want to face her, not now, but he knew he didn't have a choice. When he stepped inside, Carter was sitting at her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She didn't look angry, but her expression was serious, her eyes sharp as they met his. "Close the door," she said, her voice calm but firm. Rick did as he was told, his stomach tightening. He stood awkwardly in front of her desk, waiting for her to speak. "I heard about your patrol today," Carter said finally, her tone measured. Rick's heart sank. Of course, she had heard. "It wasn't anything major," he said quickly. "Just a group of kids hanging out. I made sure it didn't escalate." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Didn't escalate," she repeated. "Rick, do you even realize what you did out there? Or more importantly, what you didn't do?" Rick frowned, unsure of what she was getting at. "I didn't do anything," he said defensively. "I just made sure everything was under control." Carter leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "Do you really think that's enough? To just keep things under control? Rick, those kids weren't doing anything wrong, but you approached them like they were criminals. And they knew it. You didn't see it, but I guarantee you they did." Rick bristled. "With all due respect, Chief, I've been doing this job a long time. I know how to read a situation." "Do you?" Carter asked, her tone sharper now. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still trying to prove something. To me, to this department, to yourself. And in the process, you're losing sight of what actually matters. Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Carter held up a hand, stopping him. Rick, she said, her voice softening, this isn't about me being hard on you. This is about making sure you don't keep repeating the same mistakes. You're not a bad cop, but you've let your ego and your assumptions guide you for far too long. If you can't learn to let go of that, you're never going to be the kind of officer this community needs. Her words hit harder than Rick expected. He wanted to fight back, to defend himself, but deep down he knew she was right. He had spent years hiding behind his badge, using it as a shield to protect himself from his own flaws. But now, with Carter holding a mirror up to him, he couldn't ignore what he saw. Carter stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of him. I know this isn't easy, she said, her voice softer now. Change never is. But you've got to decide what kind of man you want to be, Rick. Not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. Because whether you like it or not, people are watching, and they're counting on you to get it right. Rick nodded, his throat tight. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just turned and left the office. As he walked out into the cool night air, Rick felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, shame, confusion. He didn't know what his next step was, but he knew one thing for certain: he was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path he chose would define not just his career, but who he was as a person. And for the first time, he wasn't sure which way to go. Rick's footsteps echoed in the empty parking lot as he made his way to his car, the weight of Carter's words still pressing down on him like a lead blanket. For years, he had believed he was untouchable, that his authority as a cop gave him the right to act without question. Now, every decision, every action, every look he gave someone was running through his head like the highlight reel of mistakes. The idea that he might have been wrong this whole time, it wasn't just humbling, it was terrifying. Sliding into the driver's seat, Rick sat in silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and staring into the darkness ahead. The streets outside the precinct were quiet, but his mind was anything but. He turned the key, and the low hum of the engine filled the air, a sound that had always grounded him, given him purpose. Tonight, it felt hollow. As he drove home, Rick noticed the streets felt different. He'd patrolled this area 100 times, but tonight there was a tension he couldn't quite place. He passed a couple of squad cars stationed outside a liquor store with flashing lights, painting the scene in red and blue. A group of officers stood near the entrance, speaking to the store clerk, but Rick didn't stop. Something about it felt routine, like the kind of call he'd handled 1,000 times before, but as he turned the corner, a shadow caught his eye. It was subtle, just a flicker of movement near an alleyway. Rick slowed down, his hand instinctively hovering over his radio. He didn't want to overreact, but something about it didn't feel right. He pulled his car to the side of the road, leaving the engine running, and stepped out. The air was colder here, the kind of chill that made you feel like something was watching you. Rick's boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the alley. He squinted into the darkness, his hand resting lightly on the holster at his side. "Anyone there?" he called out, his voice steady but cautious. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the faint hum of a streetlight flickering overhead and the distant sounds of traffic. Then, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on pavement, echoed from deeper within the alley. Rick's heart began to race. He took a step forward, his hand tightening on his holster. "Come out where I can see you," he said, his tone firm now. A figure emerged slowly from the shadows, hands raised in surrender. It was a boy, no older than 16, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His clothes were torn, and there was a fresh cut on his cheek, the blood glistening under the dim light. Rick frowned, lowering his hand slightly. "What are you doing out here, kid? Are you hurt?" The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to appear behind him. I can't go home," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick stepped closer, trying to get a better look at him. Why not? What's going on? The boy shook his head, his eyes darting around nervously. They'll find me if I go back. Rick's chest tightened. Who's they? He asked, his voice softening. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his whole body trembling. Rick could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands shook even though he was trying to stay calm. Hey, it's all right, Rick said, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. I'm not here to hurt you. Let me help. The boy hesitated, his eyes locking with Rick's for a moment. But before he could say anything, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the alley. The boy flinched, his eyes widening in panic. They're here, he whispered, his voice trembling. Rick turned toward the sound, his instincts kicking in. He reached for his radio, but before he could call for backup, a dark SUV screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley. The doors flew open, and two men stepped out, their faces shadowed but their intentions clear. One of them had a baseball bat slung over his shoulder, the other a knife glinting in the light. Rick's hand went to his weapon, his body tensing. Stay behind me, he said to the boy, his voice low but firm. The man with the bat stepped forward, his lips curling into a sneer. This doesn't concern you, officer. Walk away, and we'll pretend we never saw you. Rick's jaw tightened. He'd been in situations like this before, but something about this one felt different. The boy was clearly terrified, and these men weren't just here to scare him. They meant business. The man with the knife laughed, a low, menacing sound. You don't get it, do you? That kid owes us, and if you don't back off, you'll owe us too. Rick's grip on his weapon tightened. He could feel the boy trembling behind him, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to protect him. But he also knew this wasn't just about the boy anymore. These men were dangerous, and if Rick wasn't careful, things could escalate fast. The man with the bat took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. Last chance, cop. Walk away. Rick didn't move. You're not touching him. The man's sneer faltered for a moment, but before Rick could react, the man with the knife lunged forward. Rick drew his weapon, aiming it squarely at the man's chest. Don't, he barked, his voice echoing through the alley. The man froze, his eyes locked on the gun. For a moment, everything was still. The tension hung heavy in the air, every second feeling like an eternity. Then the boy behind Rick spoke, his voice barely audible but filled with fear. It's not just them. There's more. They're watching. Rick's stomach sank. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The boy's words sent a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was bigger than he'd realized, and he was right in the middle of it. The man with the bat smirked, like he knew something Rick didn't. You should have walked away, he said, his tone almost mocking. Before Rick could respond, the SUV's headlights flicked on, blinding him for a moment. In the confusion, the two men retreated, disappearing into the shadows. The engine roared to life, and the SUV sped off, leaving Rick and the boy alone in the alley. Rick lowered his weapon, his heart pounding. He turned to the boy, who was still trembling, his eyes wide with fear. You need to tell me what's going on, Rick said, his voice firm but not unkind. The boy hesitated, then looked up at Rick, his voice trembling. You don't understand. They're everywhere. And for the first time in his career, Rick felt the cold grip of doubt. This wasn't just a routine call, wasn't just a simple situation to de-escalate. This was something bigger, something darker. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. Rick's mind raced as the boy's words echoed in his ears. Asterisk, they're everywhere. Asterisk. The statement wasn't just fear. It was certainty, a plea from someone who had seen more than he should. Rick felt his instincts kick into overdrive, but for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if they were enough to handle what was unfolding. He needed backup, but calling it in might put the boy at more risk. The men in the SUV were clearly organized, deliberate. Whoever they were, They wouldn't just leave loose ends hanging. Rick knew he had to act fast. "All right, kid," Rick said, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "You're going to tell me everything. Who are these guys? Why are they after you?" The boy hesitated, his lips trembling as he struggled to find the words. They work for someone. A man. He's been recruiting people, kids like me, to work for him." Rick frowned, his pulse quickening. Recruiting for what? The boy swallowed hard. Anything. Drugs, stealing, breaking into places. If you don't do what he says, you disappear. I saw it happen to my friend. His voice broke, and he wiped at his face. I couldn't do it anymore. I ran. Rick's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a random run-in. It was a glimpse into something much larger, a network operating right under his nose. "What's this man's name?" he asked, keeping his tone calm, even as his mind churned with possibilities. The boy looked around nervously, as if saying the name would summon the man himself. "Milo," he whispered. "Everyone's scared of him. He has people everywhere." Rick felt his stomach twist. The name rang a bell. Milo Branson, a name that had floated around the precinct in hushed tones, tied to suspected organized crime, but never pinned with anything solid. Rick had thought Milo was just a rumor, an urban legend whispered by street informants. But now, staring at the boy's terrified face, he knew Milo was very real. The boy flinched as headlights appeared at the end of the street, a slow-moving sedan with tinted windows creeping toward them. Rick grabbed the boy's arm, pulling him toward his squad car. "Get in," he said sharply. The boy didn't argue, scrambling into the passenger seat as Rick slid into the driver's side. The sedan picked up speed, and Rick didn't wait to see what would happen next. He floored the gas, the tires screeching as the car shot down the street. The sedan followed, its headlights glaring in the rearview mirror. Rick's training took over as he weaved through the narrow streets, his heart pounding. But this wasn't just about outrunning the car. It was about protecting the boy. He couldn't risk leading them back to the precinct or anywhere public. Rick gritted his teeth, glancing at the boy. "Not if I can help it." He made a sharp turn down a side street, the sedan close behind. He spotted an abandoned warehouse up ahead, its windows shattered and its exterior cloaked in darkness. It wasn't ideal, but it was his best option. He killed the headlights and pulled into the lot, steering the car behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. "Stay down," Rick ordered the boy as he turned off the engine. He drew his weapon, his eyes scanning the lot as the sedan slowed to a stop near the entrance. The doors of the sedan opened, and 3 men stepped out, their silhouettes outlined by the dim streetlights. Rick recognized 2 of them from the alley, but the 3rd man was new, tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that made it clear he was in charge. Even without an introduction, Rick knew this had to be Milo. Milo's voice cut through the night, low and commanding. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, officer. Hand over the boy, and we'll pretend this never happened." Rick stepped out from behind a shipping container, his weapon raised. "You think I'm just going to hand him over to you? You're out of your mind." Milo chuckled, his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets. "You don't know what you're dealing with, do you? This isn't about one kid. He's just a small piece of the puzzle. Walk away, and you can keep playing the hero for someone else." Rick's grip on his weapon tightened. "You're underestimating me." Milo's smile faded, and he signaled to his men. "I gave you a chance." The 2 men moved toward Rick, their movements deliberate. Rick fired a warning shot into the air, his voice firm. "Don't." They froze, but Milo didn't flinch. "You're just one cop," Milo said, his tone almost amused. "How far do you think you're going to get?" Rick didn't respond. He knew he was outnumbered, but he also knew he couldn't let Milo win. The boy's life, and likely many others, depended on it. Before Milo could say anything else, the sound of sirens cut through the night, growing louder with each passing second. Rick allowed himself a small breath of relief. He had managed to press the silent alarm button in his car before pulling into the lot. Backup was on its way. Mayo's expression darkened as the sirens grew closer. He signaled to his men, and they retreated toward the sedan. "This isn't over," Mayo said, his eyes locking with Rick's. "You've just made yourself a very dangerous enemy." Rick didn't lower his weapon until the sedan disappeared into the night. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, 2 squad cars pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. Carter stepped out of one of them, her expression unreadable as she approached Rick. "What the hell happened here?" she demanded. Rick glanced back at the boy, who was still huddled in the car. "We've got a bigger problem than we thought," he said, his voice grim. Carter followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing. "Who's the kid?" Rick hesitated. "A witness. And if what he's saying is true, we're up against someone bigger than we've ever dealt with." Carter studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll take him back to the precinct, get him somewhere safe. But Rick," she paused, her tone softening, "you've got a target on your back now. Be ready." Rick nodded, but as he looked at the boy, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Mayo's words lingered in his mind. Asterisk, "You've just made yourself a very dangerous enemy." Asterisk. Back at the precinct, as the boy was placed in protective custody, Rick sat at his desk, his thoughts racing. He had done the right thing, he was sure of that. But the cost of his actions was only beginning to reveal itself. And just as he was beginning to feel the weight of it all, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A deep, familiar voice spoke on the other end. "You think you've won, officer? You've only scratched the surface. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." The line went dead, and Rick sat frozen, the realization sinking in. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Rick sat at his desk, staring at his phone long after the mysterious call had ended. Mayo's words echoed in his head like a drumbeat. Asterisk, "You've only scratched the surface." Asterisk, he could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the danger of it all sinking deeper into his chest. The boy was safe for now, but Rick knew that Milo wouldn't just let this go. People like him never did. Carter stepped into the room, her expression softer than usual. She set a steaming cup of coffee on Rick's desk and sat down across from him. "You good?" she asked, her voice low enough so no one else in the precinct could hear. Rick exhaled slowly and picked up the cup. "No," he admitted, "this is bigger than us. Milo's not just running some small-time operation, he's got people everywhere, and now he knows I'm in his way." Carter nodded, her face grim. "We've got eyes on the boy. He's in protective custody with 2 of our best officers watching him. Milo won't get to him." Rick shook his head. "It's not just about him, Carter. There are more kids out there, more lives he's ruined. We need to shut this down." Carter leaned back in her chair, studying him for a moment. "You're not wrong, but we can't take him down without evidence. And right now, we don't have enough. Mayo's been smart, kept his hands clean, while letting everyone else do his dirty work. If we want to stop him, we're going to have to play this right." Rick sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right, but the thought of waiting, of letting Milo operate for even one more day, made his skin crawl. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his voice heavy. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "We start building a case. We get statements from the boy, track down anyone else who's been caught in Milo's web. We follow the money, the connections, anything that can tie him directly to the crimes. It's going to take time, but it's the only way to bring him down for good." Rick nodded, though the frustration still burned in his chest. Time was a luxury the boy, and the others like him, might not have. But rushing in without a solid plan could make things worse. He had to trust the process, no matter how much it grated on him. Over the next few weeks, the precinct worked tirelessly to piece together Milo's operation. The boy, whose name was Devin, slowly began to open up, providing details about how Milo's network operated. It was worse than Rick had imagined. Milo's reach extended far beyond the city, with ties to trafficking, drugs, and a network of enforcers who kept everyone in line through fear. Devon's testimony was crucial, but it wasn't enough. Rick and Carter spent long nights combing through records, tracking down leads, and interviewing anyone who might have information. Some were too scared to talk, but others, emboldened by the knowledge that Mayo's operation was being exposed, began to come forward. One night, as Rick was poring over surveillance footage from one of Milo's suspected fronts, Carter walked into the room holding a file. "We got something," she said, her tone urgent. Rick looked up, his exhaustion briefly forgotten. "What is it?" She handed him the file. Financial records. One of Milo's former associates finally cracked. "He gave us access to a shell company Milo's been using to launder money. It's enough to get a warrant." Rick felt a surge of hope for the first time in weeks. "This could be it," he said, flipping through the pages. "We can finally hit him where it hurts." The next morning, armed with the warrant, a team of officers raided one of Milo's warehouses. Rick was part of the team, his heart pounding as they stormed the building. Inside, they found evidence of Milo's operation, ledgers, drugs, and even a few of his enforcers who were caught off guard. It was a major win, but Milo himself was nowhere to be found. As Rick stood in the middle of the chaos, watching officers haul away evidence, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. His gut twisted as he answered. "Well done, officer," Milo's voice drawled on the other end. "You've caused me quite the inconvenience." Rick's grip tightened on the phone. "It's over, Milo. We've got enough to put you away." Milo chuckled, the sound cold and mocking. "You really think you've won? You've taken a piece of the puzzle, but you'll never see the whole picture. Enjoy your little victory." The line went dead, and Rick stood there, the weight of Milo's words sinking in. Even with the evidence they had gathered, Milo still felt untouchable. But Rick wasn't about to let him slip away. In the days that followed, the evidence from the warehouse proved invaluable. It tied Milo to numerous crimes, giving the precinct enough leverage to issue a warrant for his arrest. But Milo was nowhere to be found. He had gone underground, leaving his operation in shambles, but still managing to elude capture. For Rick, it wasn't the ending he had hoped for. Milo was still out there, a shadow looming over the city. But as he sat in his car one evening, watching Devon walk into his new foster home, a sense of peace settled over him. The boy was safe, finally free from the grip of fear that had ruled his life for so long. Rick knew the fight wasn't over. Milo was still a threat, and there were others like him who preyed on the vulnerable. But for now, Rick had made a difference. He had given Devon a chance at a better life, and that was a victory worth holding on to. As Rick drove away, the city lights reflecting,